Okay, good morning everybody. My name's Rachel Lawson. I'm the Alumni Relations and Development Director, and it is so exciting to be launching the first session of today. So thank you for being here, and particular thanks to our speakers, who I'd just like to introduce very briefly. Today we've got Professor Mark Berlin with us, who studied here for an MPhil in International Relations in 1979. That is when international relations was in its infancy, really. He's in conversation with a current student, Nanna Sæten, and also with Jakob Lundwall, who graduated from here a couple of years ago, and he's currently working in the Austrian Federal Chancellery. This session is significant for another reason as well. Because it is a moment for us to be able to remember those in our community who loved Leckhampton but are no longer with us. And Dr. Aaron Rapport was a fellow here in politics and international relations between 2014 and 2019, when sadly he died of cancer, and I'm sure he'd be delighted that this session was happening today, as would Professor Christopher Colclough, who worked at, and I need to get this right, at the Centre for Education and International Development. And for him, Leckhampton was a very special place, and he supported and supports postgraduate student funding, and also, through a gift in his will, has enabled us to purchase Hampton Lodge, which is being renamed Christopher Colclough Lodge, which is a property at the bottom of Leckhampton Drive, which we will be using for fourth year undergraduate students. So it will be like a bridging house between the undergraduate and the postgraduate community, which is very much the spirit of how the Master, Professor Christopher Kelly, is wanting us to look at our community and see ourselves as special in our differences, but also stronger altogether. So without further ado, let me pass the floor to our wonderful speakers, and thank you to everybody for being here today.
Good morning. I'm Mark Berlin, and I'm truly honored and excited to be sharing the stage with Nanna and Jakob, two truly outstanding academics. And I believe the future is bright when I have chatted with them, and I really believe that they will make outstanding contributions in their field. I'd also like to thank the Master, Christopher Kelly at the back, along with Warden J.D. Rhodes, really for their kindness and generosity, making me feel so welcome and feel like I'm back at home. It's really been delightful. Everybody from the Porters, Simon and Lee and Mark, Denise who cleans my room, everybody's just, Wayne who just seems to be omnipresent, taking care of all the maintenance, electrical stuff. Everybody's just made me feel so welcome at Corpus. It's just been delightful. Most especially I have to thank Rachel Lawson and her outstanding staff, Charlotte and Sarah and others, who really have made this, Rachel in particular, with her really gentle and kind manner to reach out to old members and make them want to feel part of this community. And of course her extraordinary efforts to make this weekend an enormous success and enabling me to participate. So thank you, Rachel. I hesitate when I stand up here, and I mentioned it a couple times at breakfast, and Rachel just outed me as somebody who matriculated in 1979. When I think about if I was a student listening to somebody who said he was here more than 40 years ago, I'd be sitting back and thinking, oh, poor guy must almost be dead at this point. But I'm pleased to tell you that I'm not yet dead, and I'm very happy to be here. Just, well, I guess I could leave it, we're doing a bit of our own moderation, so I'll leave it to...
Yeah, thank you so much for being here, Mark, and I'm sure everybody here is very excited to hear your take on current international relations and issues in international relations. But in honor of the occasion that we're here today celebrating the 60th anniversary, I wanted to ask you how you remember Leck in your daily life and what Leckhampton has meant to you in your life so far.
Oh, great, thank you. That's nice, thank you. Well, I could tell you that I could not have conceived of the trajectory of my career at the time that I was a student here But I am certain of one thing, that my life and my career truly could not have occurred but for being here at Corpus. Of that, there's no question. Being in Cambridge and receiving my degree here literally was life and career altering. It may sound trite, but I have to tell you that I believe Corpus empowered me to be bold and to seek out opportunities and to make a contribution or a difference in some of the work that I did. So I'm forever grateful for Corpus. It's something that's lasted with me my whole life. From my time here at Leckhampton, I have 3 messages that I could share with you. My first, for the students who are in the first few rows and scattered throughout, I just want to make sure that you embrace the splendor and awe that is Corpus Christi. I hope you never take for granted the privilege of attending this magnificent institution. Enjoy every walk, every pint, every punt, every class. Keep those memories firmly planted in your mind, and hopefully those memories will guide you both morally and deliberately as you make your future career and life decisions. And above all, make sure you have time to have fun. My second message is, believe in your own good fortune and continue to make your own luck. And let me explain. And I could do so by taking you back to my very first week here at Corpus. The message I want to give in particular is, don't be afraid to pivot and make decisive changes as opportunities present themselves. So for me, my first real pivot began a couple of weeks before classes actually started. I was actually having breakfast in the late summer. It was August. It was a couple of weeks before classes started, and I was having breakfast in Leckhampton. And I had a chance encounter at breakfast one morning with a professor who was on sabbatical and doing his studies here for a term. He was a professor from the University of Durham, the brilliant and kind Professor Colin Warbrick. And he was taking, as I said, a sabbatical turn here at Corpus. And I was here early before classes started, so it was very, very random. And he inquired about my academic plans. And the more I chatted to him, the more I was intrigued about his path in public international law. I had graduated from law school in Canada, and so I was coming to think what would naturally be just the next step, which is going to be my LLM, my master's in law. But during the course of breakfast, he completely altered my plan, and he agreed actually to act as my academic supervisor and thesis supervisor. And the Board of Graduate Studies quickly accepted our plan, and I switched from the LLM to the MPhil, which was far more suited to my personality and interests. And so just a chance encounter with someone who took an interest in me provided me with the luck and the good fortune, and I took the opportunity, and I'm forever grateful for that very quirky chance encounter. My third message to students in particular is just continue doing what Corpus has in its core DNA. Just continue to practice kindness and be prepared to mentor younger persons who come into your life. You can't underestimate the significant impact that you can have on somebody's life. To this day, I'm embarrassed to say I never really reached out and thanked Colin Warbrick for the kindness that he showed me and taking that chance. And I regret that. But I try to make up for it now by being a mentor to a lot of students and helping them make career path decisions as well. So that was my time at Leckhampton.
Thank you. I mean, my question would obviously have been, what was the naughtiest thing that happened here in your time? But naturally, unless you want to tell us. But do you remember anything that really? No. My actual question is, I mean, I'm not implying that you were here from the very start of when Leckhampton was founded, but I can imagine that when Leckhampton was set up as a concept and as an ambit for young students, my idea was just, do you think back in the day there was a different esprit, a different sort of ethos to it, you know, something, you know, at the vanguard of something, because obviously this was revolutionary and new as an idea, as a proposal.
Well, what I could say to that's a great question. The second part of the question was good. The first part wasn't so good. The first part maybe we'll talk about later.
Yes.
People have also asked me when I've called home this past week, you know, what's changed about Cambridge? And I said, well, basically in our college after 670 years, nothing. It's the same. And there's a certain delight in coming back to something that's familiar. And at the same time, it's transformed. And it's not the same. When I was here, it was predominantly an all-white male Christian college. And so the richness that we have now in the community is evidenced by the student body and the faculty. And to me, that is just the reality mirroring the world today. What Leckhampton, I think, strove to do, continues to do, and does successfully, is it creates family. And I think, you know, I've just met a couple of individuals this morning from 72, 73 and 79. We just had a quick hello over breakfast this morning. But there's a certain bond that you create by just being here. And you may not see somebody for 40 plus years, Dr. Simon Jarvis, and then you catch up with them the night before, and it's like you've never been away. It's extraordinary. And so Corpus gives you that sense of family that which I think is probably unique to Cambridge, and I just don't think you get anywhere else. So congratulations to them on their 60th, and here's to the next 60th. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. I wanted maybe to move a little bit towards your very exciting career that now your current position is as a professor of practice at McGill. But I wanted to ask you first, how did you start off your career after graduating from Corpus, and what kind of led you on the way?
And how can I copy you?
You will succeed, and you will exceed. You're right. When I was at Corpus, I started applying for jobs, and I wasn't sure what I was going to do. And so I had 3 career opportunities as I applied. I sent a lot of applications, as you do in your last term and in your last year. You're thinking, oh my gosh, now I have to get into the real world. So I had 3 applications out, and I got 3 offers. And one was from the Department of Justice in Canada, where I'd go back and I could do my pupillage, my articling, and do my bar admissions to become a barrister solicitor in Canada. The other one was with the International Red Cross in Geneva. And the third is very quirky. You'll find this very curious. But I got accepted to become a professor of law at the University of Arkansas in Little Rock. I mean, think about how extraordinarily random and quirky that is. The only thing is, at the same time, you have to remember, Bill and Hillary Clinton were professors of law at the University of Arkansas in Little Rock. Yeah. Who knew? I mean, that wasn't anything I knew. We didn't know them on the world stage. So either one of those paths would have led me to have a life in a different direction. But I chose to go back to Canada and get fully accredited to always at least say, I could always be at least, no matter what I do in my career, I can always fall back and at least be a full barrister and solicitor in Canada. But I always loved academia, and so right away, I accepted my job at the Department of Justice. I immediately started in September, and at the same time, I started teaching at the university. Again, don't underestimate the power of a postgraduate degree from Cambridge University. When you go back to North America, it's like, wow, that's pretty impressive. Sometimes we take it for granted because we're just living the experience. But you have to understand, it gives you a leg up, and it really is quite an extraordinary ticket for your future successes. I was lucky, so I started teaching at the university in the law faculty, but my career was at the Department of Justice. And so very briefly, I'll just give you 30 seconds because we want to talk about international relations. I had 4 different stints throughout my career where I became legal and policy advisor to 4 different attorney generals and ministers of justice. We have a joint portfolio of attorney general and minister of justice. And I actually served 2 liberal governments and 2 conservative governments, which is quite the trick. But as I'll explain later in international relations, Canada politically rules from the center. Center right, center left. There's not such a great divide. And so I was able to transverse that sort of political roads in the country, and I was able to serve them. I ultimately became head of international development, which is really what I want to talk about today. And at the same time, I was the special advisor to the Minister of Justice on the Middle East, which is an area that you and I have in common. And so that was and then today I teach at McGill in my retirement, and I actually serve as the senior counsel to the Commissioner for Federal Judicial Affairs, which is the smallest government department in the Canadian government. And we are the interface of the Canadian federal judiciary of 1,200 judges to the government, because they cannot be part of the legislature, they can't be part of the executive, they can't really be part of government. So we are a small body of 57 individuals who are required to ensure and maintain the independence and the integrity of Canada's federal judiciary. And I'm lucky enough to think that they think I have something to offer. So I've been there for a few years as their senior advisor. And that's basically my career. But let's get to the good stuff. Ask the meaty questions now.
Are we continuing with you, or are we going in medias res and...
I think we'll just go to the current events.
Okay. Are we all doomed? Because what we see now is a barrage of, bad news, essentially.
Yeah.
Europe in decline, the West in decline, powers elsewhere on the rise, a sense of competition, erosion. I mean, I remember when I started, I did history before, but when I slipped into international relations and politics here, everyone said, "You're so lucky. I mean, this is a big crisis. What a moment to be alive." And every single year after that, I had the same sense. We're in crisis. What a time to be alive. This is fantastic. This is really the time to study international relations. How can we maintain a sense of optimism in all this doom and gloom? Is it really as bad as it sounds?
Yes and no. And so I'm going to give you 3 examples. And international relations is like a yes and no. First of all, I'm going to look at international relations from my lens, which is international development, and that's what I do. And international development, for me, there's so many different components of international development. I do it from a rule of law perspective. I'm a lawyer. And so my work includes, as the head of international development for the Canadian Department of Justice, was to establish justice systems in failed and fragile states. So we'd go into war-torn zones, and the very basis of trying to help establish a viable society has to start off with the building blocks of rule of law, of establishing a justice system, a prosecution department, police, patrol officers, law schools. And so when I kept that in mind, I always thought, I'm not solving the crisis, but I'm making a pretty good contribution towards getting us somewhere. So I'll give you 3 examples. Okay, the first I'll talk about is Canada-U.S. relations. I thought I'll deviate a little bit, but I want to give you a glimpse of Canada-U.S. relations from my perspective as a Canadian, because I think what you perceive of the United States is different from how we're impacted by it being just north of the border of America. I'm then going to give you a brief glimpse into the Middle East, and then I want to talk a bit about Ukraine. So first I'll talk about living beside the superpower. So former Prime Minister Pierre Elliott Trudeau is famously reported to have said, "When the elephant sneezes, everyone catches a cold." Well, essentially that's true. And just last month, well-known Canadian journalist Michael Harris said that the cold civil war boiling away in America has reached our shores in Canada and has crossed the border. So let me give you some facts. 299 out of the 569 Republican candidates at the state and federal level in the recent midterm election were election deniers. And after 60 failed court challenges, innumerable recounts that confirmed that Biden won by a comfortable lead, yet still 53% of Americans continue to push their baseless conspiracy theories. Trump parlayed his character of unfiltered abuse, imperious ignorance, untamed egotism, or flecks of bigotry into really establishing this toxic political environment where the other party, the Democrats, is not so much seen as opposition, but is demonized as evil incarnate. And while we watched with fascination for the 4 years of the disruptive tenure of Trump, we were directly affected by it in a way not like any other country. And we caught more than a cold. Now, I don't even want to contemplate, and we can go on maybe between questions and answers about a second Trump presidency. But the Washington Post wrote recently, a couple of weeks ago, that the twice impeached president's tenure was a festival of democratic norm breaking, culminating in the big lie. For me, the audacity to even think of an untethered, revenge-seeking second term to president is almost too frightening to contemplate. Now, the good news is the midterms elections that we just saw in the United States showed, however, some frailties. And the MAGA election deniers did not succeed as expected. And it looks like the Democrats may hold on to the Senate, might even get the House, which is extraordinary because there's supposed to have been this red wave. Most importantly is Rupert Murdoch, who has his media empire in the United States and Fox News, right? The Wall Street Journal, the New York Post, this week had headlines in the New York Post, which is Trump's favorite newspaper. And one headline with a caricature had a bloated Trump sitting on a wall, and they said the wall that he couldn't build. It said, Trumpty Dumpty had a great fall. That's the New York Post. That's Rupert Murdoch, one of his most staunch media supporters. So you have to wonder, has there been a bit of a breakage there? But let me explain to you how it's traveled north into Canada. While we watched sanctimoniously what happened on January 6th, culminating in the assault on the Capitol, we thought to ourselves, well, that can never happen here in Canada. And yet, to a certain extent, it actually happened in Canada. To a lesser extent, but a month later, it happened. Now, I don't know how many people have heard of, because it was big in North America. I don't know if you've heard of the trucker convoy, or the convoy. Did anybody hear about the convoy? Yeah. It's funny, because I live part of the year in the United States, and people say, where are you from? And I'd say, Ottawa. And they go, Ohio? And I go, Ottawa. And they go, Iowa? And I go, Ottawa. Last year they say, where are you from? I'd say, Ottawa. They go, oh, the trucker convoy. I'm so proud. So this trucker convoy descended on Parliament Hill and really held hostage an entire city for several weeks in February and March, just last year. The protesters were waving Trump and Nazi flags in the Ottawa capital. And most Canadians watch in horror as we witnessed our own homegrown version of right-wing populism. We're thinking, how does that happen? Now, the convoy's purpose was not just to disrupt daily life, but they actually had a plan to change government. If you could believe it, they want to establish this weird conglomerate of a new government where they would establish a trucker committee with the opposition party, with the Governor General, the Queen's representative, taking over as the head of the country. I mean, it's just bizarre when you think about it. And think, okay, well, that's done, gone. Well, in September of this year, the Conservative Party, which is the opposition party, the major opposition party, just elected a very right-wing, almost extremist. His name is Pierre Poilievre, and he openly flirts with the right wing. In fact, he took media to go watch him do a 2-hour march with the Freedom Convoy. He's thrown himself into that camp. He's with election deniers. He's anti-vaxxer. He talks about being Prime Minister, quote, to get rid of the gatekeepers, to defund the CBC, which is our version of the BBC, to abolish mask mandates, and, quote, to make Canada the freest country on earth so you can take control of your life. Well, that sounds pretty MAGA to me. And last month, we saw the election of a provincial premier, Danielle Smith in Alberta, who ran a very right-wing campaign and promises never to have another lockdown, and promises to introduce legislation provincially that would deny the right of the federal government to enact any laws that she says is not in the interest of Alberta. So like a successionist type of government. So Canada is used to 55 years of governance, as I say, from the middle, left and right. And that's been a recipe for political success. However, Pierre Poilievre, this more extreme right-wing agenda, threatens to disrupt our natural reality, as was recently realized in Italy, Sweden, and of course in Israel, which I'll turn to now as I turn to the Middle East. I thought it would be interesting for you to get just a glimpse of my perception of Canada-US relationships, because I think it might not be how you would necessarily perceive it over here. So let me turn to the Middle East. an area of your interest, and I'll give you my thoughts. Again, from a development perspective, and I should say, as an employee of both the Crown Corporation and the Canadian government, my remarks are as a professor at McGill. It's, of course, not made in any context as an employee of the government. So, however, Canada does maintain its position in the Middle East that there should be a two-state solution. I could tell that I was an election observer in the last PA election, probably 13 years ago, and I also served as a special advisor on the Middle East to the Minister of Justice and Attorney General of Canada in the early 2000s. Firstly, I'll claim my biases, and then we'll get that off the table. I am a staunch supporter of the State of Israel. I'm also a staunch supporter of the Palestinian Authority. I don't see that there has to be a distinction. As Director General of International for the Department of Justice, I had an office in Ramallah for over 10 years. And the purpose of being there was we were helping to establish a functioning Attorney General's office for the Palestinian. And we had to work with 7 different legal systems, and we had to work in the 16 or so judicial districts of the Palestinian Authority. Recently, and so we spent 10 years working there. We worked very closely with the Attorney General, with the Minister of Justice, with the Palestinian government. To me, I don't think I have it in my remarks, but what I want to say is that in international development, and here's where you ask about the promise of hopefulness or not, for there to be peace in the Middle East, Israel needs a strong partner. And so the Palestinians need strong institutions of statehood with which they can then negotiate on an equal basis with Israel. Israel wants there to be a strong partner. It does them no favor to have somebody who's weakened and unable to negotiate them at the same level. And so we were trying to just shore up one component, which was the justice sector. Now, this year has been a really challenging one. So far, there have been over 180 shootings in Israel and the Palestinian Authority, compared to just 61 in 2021. 131 Palestinians, not including in Gaza, and 21 Israelis and foreigners have been killed so far. Security has evaporated in many parts of the West Bank, especially around Jenin and Nablus. At 87, Mahmoud Abbas, or Abu Mazen, is really, sadly, losing his grip on authority. And the thing that we have to be most frightened about is the collapse and dissolution of the Palestinian Authority, and Fatah, I think, will be the biggest threat to the status quo. And even if we don't like the status quo, the breakup of Fatah and Abbas will render it into an even more perilous situation. Very worrying is the emergence of 2 new resistance groups, and some call them terrorist groups. So there's the Jenin Brigade, and there's something called the Lion's Den in Nablus. They are fast growing, and they're acting outside the authority of the PA, Hamas, and Islamic Jihad. So that's on one side. On the other hand, because Israel is a country of on one hand, on the other hand. So you ask me, is there hope? Well, on the other hand, there's the promise of the recent Abraham Accords, where we have Bahrain, the UAW, and Israel in the Accords. We have the Moroccan Normalization Agreement of 2020, of course, long-standing Egypt and Jordanian diplomatic relations, and as was reported in the Wall Street Journal last week, Israeli businessmen attended Saudi Arabia's preeminent financial investment conference in Riyadh. There is an emerging N7 initiative, which claims to connect Israeli high government officials with their counterparts from Egypt, Jordan, Morocco, Bahrain, Sudan, and the UAE, as announced by President Herzog at the Atlantic Council in Washington at the end of October 2022. This first N7 initiative, which is broader than the Negev Forum from the March of 2022, presided over by Secretary of State Anthony Blinken, and it did not include Jordan or Sudan, which is absent from the Abraham Accords simply because there's a military coup in Sudan. So the very first N7 initiative of those broader countries is scheduled to take place December 7th in Rabat to focus on education and coexistence. And the UAE will host another gathering on agricultural, food and security and water. And a third one in 2023 will focus on the development of regional trade zones. That's positive. On the other hand, so I have to keep switching hands. On the other hand, we have the return of Likud and Netanyahu in government. The frightening prospect there is the coalition is being shored up by extreme right-wing factions. And you have this individual, Ben-Gvir, who was on terrorist watch lists up until recently. He was a member of Kach, the Rabbi Kahane outlawed terrorist organization for many years, and he himself was put on terrorist watch lists. He's now in line to become the Secretary for Police or the Minister for Police. Sort of a frightening prospect. 2 days ago, the State Department said Ben-Gvir attended a memorial service for Rabbi Kahane, who was a terrorist. And this guy, Ben-Gvir, attended a memorial service, and then the Secretary of State press secretary, Ned Price, came out and he said, celebrating the legacy of a terrorist organization is abhorrent. There's no better word. It is abhorrent. And so Israel, as we can discuss through your talk and then through question and answers, is multi-complex. There's, on one hand, on the other hand, I always leave my trips to the Middle East with a sense of hope. I've never yet left without a sense of hope, because when I meet with ordinary Israelis or ordinary Palestinians, what I'm struck with is that they want the same thing. They want the government not to interfere in their lives. They want their kids to go to school, and they want a roof over their heads. That's their preoccupation. The other stuff tends to take national news. I mean, that's my simplistic view of it. So I think I can say that there is that sort of hope that remains, despite having on one hand and on the other hand. I'll quickly just leave you with a couple of things. One is Ukraine. I think this frightening and unnecessary and callous war is probably the single greatest threat I think that we face globally right now. I worked for about 10 years in Ukraine, where we worked to help the government of Ukraine to accede to the Treaty Against Corruption, which was a precursor to allow them to join the EU. Sadly, those of you who know anything about Ukraine, it's corrupt. And they were not able to accede to the Treaty Against Corruption. It is corrupt in many of its institutions. For the last 5 years, with my work with the federal judiciary, we have an international program where we're helping to train judges. And we're helping about judicial appointment and trying to get them to understand notions of the independence of the judiciary. We were trying to increase the salaries for judges, because if you don't have a well-paid judiciary, they're open to bribes, right? If they can't get a good standard of living to afford housing, then one of the parties goes up to them in a dispute and says, well, if I give you so many more grivnas and you can have so much more money, and if you're getting a salary lesser than or the same as a bus driver, you might be open for that. So there's so many things that we have to work on. Now, your situation it will be more perilous in the United States than us in Canada and North America, because your energy supplies will be imperiled. And of course, we all collectively hold our breath to see what the next grotesque move will be from Putin. He's leaving Kherson. Is he really? I don't know. I think there's skepticism. They show he's leaving. They have people demonstrating in the streets and waving flags. I'm not sure that there's not some other subterfuge there. So that's my thought. I think in the last 2 minutes left to me. Do I have 2 minutes left?
Approximately, yeah.
Okay. In the last 2 minutes left, let me just give you my final thoughts about international development work writ large. And some obvious truths gained from my experiences working in Bangladesh, Sudan, the Palestinian Authority, Afghanistan, just to name a few. For anybody for students contemplating any work in this area, I think some basic foundational principles. One is, it's a privilege to work in this field. It's extraordinarily a privilege. Secondly, I think if you can work meaningfully and deeply understand the uniqueness of the cultural, societal, and political religious divides when you go into your work, and you don't import your own colonial or imperialist attitudes going in. I'll give you a quick example. In Afghanistan, where we were situated for just a small period of time, at the collapse of the government, when the Americans and the Canadians and the Europeans were rushing in to save Afghanistan, there was so much donor overlaps that the American government said, well, we'll take care of this part of the rule of law. And they said, we'll give them a criminal code. Well, that's pretty cool. Just create a criminal code for Afghanistan. And what they did was they took the Texas criminal code and they translated it into Pashto and Farsi. And that was the criminal law for Afghanistan. Don't do that. The second thing is, popular risings versus enshrined laws can emerge and throw out the status quo. And you just have to look right now to 22-year-old Masha Amini, arrested by the morality police for allegedly not wearing her hijab properly. So far, 450 people are dead. 25,000 people have been arrested. 2 weeks ago, I was in Vancouver working, and I met two Iranian women. And they said to me, this time it feels different. And I said, like I said, is anything going to change? And they said, this time it's not just in the urban settings, it's rural, it's widespread. The media's starting to hear about it. So I think you have to understand, the 1979 revolution took 1 year. This has just been 2 months. So we might be on the cusp of something. Fourthly, development work is tough, it's important, and we necessarily work in dangerous fields, and that's why we're there. But there are rewards. One thing I'll leave with you, two final words, and I'd like, maybe we'll talk about this later. Why do we do this work? Why do people engage in international development work? Why are we doing international relations and trying to assist other countries? Do we do it out of a sense of altruism? Or are we doing it out of a state of somehow sort of benevolence? And the imperial sense that noblesse oblige, we know better. I'm not sure. I do know that we try to create stability abroad, which lessens the opportunities for the exploitation of criminality and terrorism to domestic shores. That's, I think, a starting point for me. But we could talk about that later. And finally, I just want to leave you again with what I started, which is that, for me, most importantly, the foundation for a sustainable development anywhere in the world lies in the establishment of strong institutions of rule of law. The work I do is predicated upon the notion that establishing the conditions to enable pursuing and establishing the conditions that enable the norms of rule of law to exist is critical. And it's the basis upon which people can live in a structured, cohesive, and accepting, respectful world. Without the rule of law, you simply cannot have sustainable development work. So I consider myself lucky that I continue to work in this field and I teach it. And I know one thing, but for Corpus, none of this could have happened. So thank you.
Thank you. Okay, no, that was my pen, that's fine. I'll also speak from here. Maybe I'll sit down for the questions. So thank you, Mark. I think as someone like me on this panel, I'm doing work in political theory, which is not completely overlapping with international relations. So it's really rewarding for me to listen to this actually quite concrete developmental work, in the sense that, it's very far from my everyday life, where I mostly read books, to be quite honest. So I'm just going to introduce briefly my PhD research, which I'm undertaking now. I'm a second-year PhD student, and then I thought I might open up for some questions, if you have any questions. Hopefully you do. So my PhD research is interested in, or is kind of directed towards, the impact of digital technologies. And I come at it from the perspective of temporalities. And this comes from my realization that, or after having read quite a bit of the literature, there is quite a pervasive argument, I think, for the fact that temporalities, or the way we position ourselves in time, has profound political consequences, especially rhetorically. So just to give an example with the MAGA slogan, "Make America Great Again," that has a very clear temporality. It talks about making, which is directed to the future, and it mentions again, which assumes that America has been great, but it's not great now. So there is this positioning in time where Trump is kind of reaching back into the past and setting an agenda for the future, which I think is an interesting way to come to the political project of Trump. So I'm trying to do something similar with digital technologies. And what I look for when I look at the discourse surrounding digital technologies is imageries of time that are recognizable to us, either from religious origin or from other secular discourses. And this sounds very opaque, I think, when I talk about it, but I thought I would give an example of the current chapter that I'm working on, which is on apocalyptic time conceptions, so religious apocalyptic time conceptions in the discourse on the singularity or the superintelligence. And I think that for those who are not so kind of familiar with the singularity as a concept, it is this idea that superintelligence, or the artificial intelligence that will be created in the future, will be so intelligent that it completely overreaches anything that humans can comprehend even. So it will be a fundamental shift where we can no longer control it, we can no longer understand it, and essentially maybe we will be the future aunts in relation to the future human, which is the superintelligence. So there's this notion that we will lose control, a new era will begin. I think it's a clear apocalyptic notion in this in the idea of the singularity, in the sense that there is this idea of linear historical time moving in one direction, and we will reach this end time where everything will be upended, and it will be either salvation or complete destruction for humanity. And the interesting thing about apocalyptic time is that the interesting thing about apocalyptic time is that it can harbor different political projects within the same time frame. So if we look to history, the church has used apocalyptic time as a way to consolidate its power, to keep its power as the mediator between God and man, and to argue for its position as the one right way towards salvation. Whereas, for example, Marxist political thought also has a very clear apocalyptic time frame to it, in the sense that you have this linear progression in history, and then at some point the revolution will come and everything will be upended. And that's a revolutionary project, so it's obviously a very different kind of politics. So what's actually happening here? I think that temporalities, or positioning in time as a way to do politics, is interesting for two reasons in this context, and I think I'll finish there. But the first is that the way we talk in time and the imageries of time that we use have a tendency to kind of fade into the background. We don't really reflect upon how someone positioned themselves in time as a political tool. And that's true mostly throughout history. I think the most famous person working on this in Cambridge is the Professor Christopher Clark in history. He's doing very interesting work. He's, amongst other things, shown how Nazi Germany positions itself against both the Roman Empire, but also, for example, created museums for the future destruction of the Soviet Union, which is an interesting temporal move in the sense that it hadn't happened yet. The second thing I wanted to say was kind of to zoom back from my project, that I think there is a tendency when we talk about these technologies, these digital technologies in particular, and I'm not saying that the singularity will happen. I'm more concerned with the kind of political projects it harbors, more than the fact that, or whether it will actually come about. But these discourses are out there. whether they are speculative or actually researched, as they are in certain departments, even in the UK. And I think there's a tendency towards talking about digital technologies as completely unprecedented and new, like introducing something that we've never seen before. And as much as that might be true in the sense that we are experiencing some very new issues based on digital technologies, I think there is something to be said for trying to look to how history has examples of the same aims and goals being pursued through different means. So I think that as new as it is, the longings that certain digital technologies are kind of directed towards are actually quite recognizable from human political history. So that's my project. Maybe I'll
Great.
sit down for the questions.
Thanks. I think what I'd like to do, I'm going to introduce Jakob, and you may stand, you may sit, you may be comfortable. We're going to take questions after we've all spoken. Dr. Jakob Lundwall is currently advisor to the Prime Minister's office, or in the Prime Minister's office, in the government of Austria. He worked it was in the EU for a while, and fascinating for me to find out is one of his specialties is the Middle East. And so I turn the floor over to Dr. Jakob.
I shall remain seated with my seatbelts firmly fastened because this is the comfiest chair I've been on today. I also feel that this sort of little get-together is the circle of life a little bit for me because I see so many echoes of my past. I lived for a bit in Canada. I have to admit, people told me Ottawa was voted the most boring city of North America. I disagree. I loved it. A really great time. When I had the pleasure of working for the European Union at the United Nations, I was there when Canada and Norway battled for a temporary seat at the Security Council. I'm really sorry to say, Canada lost, but Norway won glamorously. I kept all the merchandise so that they tried to bribe us with. And you upstaged me with your socks today, but I'm happy to see that I have a fellow sock enthusiast. My of course, everything I say today is not in the name of the people I work for, which is the Austrian government, the Austrian Federal Chancellery. So it's just my views, of course. Thank you for the disclaimer as well. My story was one I started doing history, particularly contemporary history, modern history, and then I sort of waded into international politics. And what I thought to be very interesting and riveting about history was Austria as my country's responsibility in the Holocaust and the murder of the European Jews and other groups, which brought me to live and work in Israel for a year at the National Holocaust Memorial Center. And that sort of was my first taste of the hotbed of international relations. We all talk about the Middle East, the Middle East conflict is, if you solve that, you solve everything. That was the big notion back in the day, but of course we know it isn't quite like that. I then came into international relations and politics. My main focus was the European Union, there especially the Common Foreign and Security Policy, CFSP. And the European Union loves acronyms and stitching together of letters. And then I advised the European Union's Foreign Service for a little while at the United Nations in New York on the Middle East peace process. And I saw diplomacy and negotiations and bickering and scenes of friendship and laughter and crying all in situ at the United Nations in New York. And what my PhD was essentially on was the creature of the diplomat, the being of the diplomat as something of a hybrid between personality, so personhood and statehood, combining elements of the character, the disposition, the habitus of the individual that they're hiring, but also these individuals borrow or lean into credentials bestowed, by their state that they're representing, and that creates, hierarchies, pecking orders, as Vincent Pouillot, a fellow Canadian, wrote so eloquently. And I just adored looking into that, interviewing these people, following these people, giving these people a chance to talk about their work. They often feel a bit overlooked. So I looked at how European Union foreign policy is created in these international fora and how these people work as best they can with the limited tools that they have at their disposal and how they, make change happen. That's essentially where I come from. Yes, I think we should go into the debate all together. And do we have some questions?
Yeah, I mean, I have a question first for you, Jakob. So, like, congratulations first on finishing your PhD and your new job.
When I flew here yesterday, I typed in doctor in my ticket. I really love that, I have to say. And thank God there was no medical emergency on the plane. So.
Yeah. No, I wanted to ask you about this move from history to international relations, why you chose to pursue a career in international relations, specifically having come from a different background.
I mean, when I stumbled, I didn't stumble, I chose to go into international relations, of course. But what really struck me and what I found to be quite fascinating and riveting was the insular character that I came across in international relations a little bit. You know, we are our own discipline and we have our own theories and our own little toolbox that we work on. And I just thought it was incredible that other disciplines weren't really involved as much: history, sociology, anthropology. It's coming more and more. What I did in my work, I tried to bring in practice theory by Bourdieu from the French school of continental thinking, and people were like, "Wow, this is so new. This is why didn't we think of this before?" And I just thought they're brethren in a certain way. I think they're closely aligned. Everything, temporality, as you mentioned. That is part and parcel of everything that makes the world go round and how we try to bring about change and how we try to influence the future. So for me, they were kindred spirits, as it were. Yes, that was sort of what had me cross the Rubicon.
Nice. I also changed from, I did comparative politics as an undergrad, which is this really quantitative kind of, yeah, and then I moved into political theory and history. So yeah, I'm just curious how the other kind of the opposite direction, how you kind of reason.
I think also when the work that I saw, and I don't know if you agree, you also worked in diplomacy in Dublin for a bit for the Norwegian embassy. I always found the most effective diplomats were the ones that were aware of the history of the interlocutors, right? Or the country. And we're not talking statistics about economic affairs and, UN charts, but really, what about the literature? What about the songs? What about the national character, if there even is such a thing, right? So it's a surefire way to establish rapport. I've found history is always, and people are always surprised. Why do you know? I don't know this about the Lebanese sectarian parliamentary system, because it's interesting and it's the icing on the cake. I find is international relations, but what's the underbelly? What's the intellectual underbelly? That was what really took my fancy, as it were. Yeah.
Why don't we open up? Hopefully something we've set up here inspires a few of you to ask some questions. Please don't be shy, because it'll help us.
Thanks so much for a really engaging discussion. I've actually got a question for Nanna. I was really interested in your discussion about temporality and what that means for us in Britain at the moment and where we are, because I think we often look back in Britain on a time of great power and wealth and influence in the world. But at the moment, I think we're really becoming more and discussing more the colonial past of the country. And what does this mean in terms of your work and where Britain's headed politically and ideologically?
Yeah, I will have to kind of improvise a little bit, because obviously I am not an expert on UK politics, but I think you're absolutely right when you say that Britain has this, or had this colonial past that used to be a great source of pride and actually a kind of backpack with of greatness that they brought into international relations, talks with other countries. They have obviously a huge, also diplomatic span as a small country that has been all around the world that they could draw on, and they have drawn on, and they continue to draw on it today. But I think this backpack has become kind of less unequivocally positive, I guess. I can't say that word, unequivocally. So it's more problematized now, and I think we see it particularly in the COP meeting that is, I think it's currently taking place, but where it's talk about how early industrializing nations should actually repair the damage that they caused to developing countries today. And so what used to be an asset for Britain has become maybe even a disadvantage in some negotiations. I'm not sure what that will do for the future political project. I guess my kind of inclination would be that it forces politicians to think about or reconsider how they position themselves in time, because if you draw on that colonial heritage today, you won't have the same kind of positive implication as you would have in the early 1900s, for example. So maybe it forces British politicians, especially in international negotiations, to find other projects, future projects, or contemporary projects that they need to focus on. I guess that would be my answer.
Something that, if I may interject, something that very briefly springs to mind here, something that I always tell my students when I had the pleasure of, teaching a little bit here, seminars and the like, and I think that fits into your question and what you said as well with temporality, is I can only speak for Europe because I just look at Europe in particular, but I always said distinguish between two things. The first thing is a society that is in actual decline, and the second thing, a society that anticipates decline. And these are two different things, and they lead to two different results, especially in voting behavior, for instance. So an example that one could give, countries that really hit rock bottom during the financial crisis, for instance, the pig countries, Portugal, Italy, Ireland, and Greece. A great deal of the voting habits that we saw were very left-leaning. People had to queue for food parcels, unemployment, going through the roof, young people disillusioned. I mean, people voted Syriza in Italy and I think Costa in Portugal, right? So left-leaning parties. I mean, it's not a one-size-fits-everything rule, but that was one thing. Whereas countries such as, say, Finland or Austria or France that hadn't hit rock bottom, but they anticipated or feared decline, they voted conservative or right-wing. That's just something that one can see. But I think this idea of temporality, we're already there, or it may happen. There's a difference to be made. And I think Britain, do they anticipate decline? Do they want to actually turn the corner, maybe? Or how did they? That's a question I just wanted to bring to your attention.
Sorry. I have a couple of questions. First of all, thank you very much, for this extremely engaging presentation. A couple of questions on Ukraine, if I may. First one, is there a chance at all for a truce to be negotiated? And I mean, obviously, it's kind of complicated right now, but is there a chance? Do you see a chance? And if this is the case, what would that agreement, what could be the key elements of that agreement? And then secondly, again on Ukraine, but looking forward, in the hope that this horrible war ends, when that ends, what are the realistic chances of Ukraine joining the EU, given that it's a deeply corrupted country, as we just, been reminded, but it's also extremely large and extremely poor, and will be even poorer afterwards. So, isn't there a risk that if that path is pursued, this is going to destabilize the EU and actually stoke massive populism even more than what we've already seen? Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. Those are I think I'm on. Those are two great questions. And so to the first, I think we will know more in the next very near future. Is Kherson withdrawal reality, or is it some sort of ploy to embed Russians somewhere else and do a counteroffensive somewhere else? He's so mad, I can't get into his mind. I can't figure out his chess game. And so I don't know where he wants. Zelensky's been saying all along, it's funny, when I was working in Ukraine, every year there was another prime minister. There was Zelensky, Tymoshenko, Yanukovych. I mean, it's just every year they just kept, and as they came in, they would either throw the other one in jail. I mean, it was just chaos and disruption. Zelensky, the most unlikely of leaders, I think has shown himself to be an extraordinary leader for his time and his people right now on a world stage. Unparalleled that this television actor would assume the clout and the moral courage to be on the world stage like this. It takes two to tango. Zelensky has said that he will not sit down if, Crimea and the Donbass has to be out of the negotiations. That's like not negotiable. Unless that land is given back, there's no negotiations. I don't know if it's going to be good enough for Putin. At this point, how does he save face? He's been withdrawing. There has to be a groundswell within Russia of mothers and fathers not wanting to send their kids to die. And I think recently I read that there was 100,000 Russian troops that have been killed during this needless, unnecessary war. Is there enough state apparatus to support there to be the beginning of popular uprising or discourse that would allow him to get back to the table with what goods? Like, how does he save face? So I don't know. Also, if you look back in history, he may be in it for the long run. He might just say, I'm happy to stick around for a couple of years. I'm in no hurry. Life is fragile. 100,000 this year, 100,000 next year doesn't mean a lot to me in a country of hundreds of millions of people. It's the cost of war, it's the cost of doing business, it's the cost of the greatness for Mother Russia. So I can't really answer that. The question on the EU is really tricky because having worked there to try to get them to accede to the basic treaties that would allow them to enter the basic categories to accede to EU acceptance just weren't present. And the war hasn't changed that. Even recently, up until about a year ago, or less, when I was working with the judges in Ukraine, we were working strong on judicial appointments and corruption within the judiciary. There's some great judges in the judiciary, but there's some not so great judges in the judiciary. And that's just one facet of the foundational principles of the justice system. So what will happen immediately in the aftermath of a war is, first of all, this is a destroyed country. The infrastructure, the monies for infrastructure to reestablish cities and towns and water and safe drinking and is going to be phenomenal. So there will probably be a worldwide conference where donor nations would get together and have to put in trillions of dollars to rebuild, which is basically in so many parts of the destroyed country. And what will emerge? Will they emerge and warmly embraced by the EU? I don't think right away. I think they flirt with it. I think the EU thinks it would be cool. They want to join NATO. They just don't have the stability yet and the non-corrupt components to let it be part of that family. So I don't know. Good questions. I have no answers.
Yeah.
My colleagues do.
No, not at all. I wanted to kind of, obviously I don't have the expertise on Ukraine or Russia, but I just think it's fascinating temporally the fact that we are so bad at predicting the future as international relations scholars. That's the curse of the field, is very much that you have all these ideas and you have all this knowledge from the past, and you try to set up scenarios, but then we turn out to be wrong so much of the time.
It's a very good point. I was on the train recently and I read a book on D-Day, and before I boarded the train, and one of the station staff members in Durham, the North, friendly, nice people, and he came to me and just wanted to chat to me, and then he pointed at my book and told me, "Oh, can you tell me how it ends?" I mean, so that's one thing. I think in terms of there's only been one way of getting into the European Union hitherto, essentially, and that was by the way of pen, right? Of the pen. So we had the founding members, they signed the declarations, right? And then every country that followed had a referendum, essentially. I'm not claiming, and this is very important to stress, I'm not claiming that this war is forced by the Ukrainians to join the European Union. But on a symbolic level of significance, it seems as though they are fighting for the right to choose their future, which they want to be a European one. So this is the first time that a country is indirectly, directly, however you may see it, taking up arms to get into the European Union, which is a novelty, right?
Yeah.
And that sort of, I think, that puts the onus on the rest of the European Union, and we've seen it in the Council declarations and the Foreign Affairs Council declarations, that, they have responsibility to open that waiting room to the European Union, to Ukraine at least. But countries like Turkey have been in the waiting room since the 70s, the Western Balkans have been waiting patiently, right? Yeah. This country wasn't, was very happy to get out quickly, but these countries have been waiting for a very long time to get in. So people like, actors like the French President Macron, who said, first of all, we need to get our own European house in order before we build an extension or, patio. I mean, there's some truth in there, because we see what Hungary does. Hungary especially, one of these days suggested, I think it was yesterday, today's Saturday, yeah, sorry, I'm still jet lagged from my flight from Austria. I think,
came from Canada.
Yes, yesterday or on Thursday, because these questions demand unanimity, Ukraine blocked the latest relief package for Ukraine. Hungary.
Wow.
Yeah. Why? Because they have rule of law issues, as we all know, and the European Union is withholding funds. So they say, tit for tat, if we can, blackmail them. So this is what we're dealing with as well. So if the system internally doesn't work, and that causes lots of dissatisfaction and disappointment with the citizens of Europe as well, then it's difficult for politicians to argue we need to build an extension, as it were, however noble the cause may seem, and how right it may well be in the future. But yes, one of the first things I was taught when I came to Cambridge is, as political scientists, never make predictions about the future. That's not for us.
Hi, I actually did my PhD here 10 years before Mark, so I think one thing you can learn from Corpus is it gives you longevity, particularly if you study history. And I spent most of my career partly in the academic world and partly as a practitioner, both in the UK and the European Union. And I agree with almost everything that the panel has said, but I think a couple of things are slightly need to get a bit more perspective. One is the political pressures you face as a diplomat giving advice to ministers, who often either, as we've seen from recent experiences in the UK, don't want to even read that advice, let alone act upon it, because they're taking their advice from the Daily Mail. And that's just the reality, that you have to factor this into account, that the enormous pressures, foreign policy is not a priority for them, and they're constantly looking at it through a domestic lens and how this can actually gain me promotion or how I can get an Instagram photo or whatever. That is the reality we have to actually face. Secondly, coming back to the historical element, and I think this is really important. We were all surprised, and politicians were surprised, when the global south didn't share our immediate condemnation of what Putin was doing in Ukraine. And for them, it was largely a European internal conflict. And they say, well, and coming back to the point about COP as well, look at what we Europeans have done, and most Europeans here, in terms of our imperial past, and how little you have taken this into account in your dealings with us over the last 10, 20, 30 years. And until we understand where they're coming from, we are never going to get a satisfactory solution to the outcomes that we want. And this comes back to the real practical issue of studying history here, and Jakob made the point really well, that you need to be able to understand the other side. And hence, studying history, I know, was a great sort of bonus for me in dealing with people I had to deal with, including in Ukraine, by the way, but also trying to tell my colleagues about where they were coming from too, because most of them had no idea. You were just given a brief and you went out and say, well, convince them of doing that. And if you don't understand where the people on the other side of the table are coming from and what they've experienced to even get there, then you've really no hope. So hence the importance of studying history, the constraints that politicians are under. And I would just add one more point in terms of cynicism here. I spent a long year dealing with corruption in the Ukraine too. 95% of the countries in the world are corrupt. Why are we spending so much time trying to win them away from the norm, Martin?
What start?
I will start.
Sadly, no one has ever tried to bribe me, I have to say.
No, but what you said there, I thought was, in terms of cynicism and the international world that we face at the moment, and countries that feel that there is a certain debt or that there is a certain past that has been left unspoken. There was a fantastic book I read recently called The Light That Failed, and it showed different ways of dealing with crises, right? And I think one of the modes that was presented reminded me slightly of Russia, which is, I don't want to say pride that has been broken or anything of the sort, but rather, if we can't have a good life, we can tear everyone down with us. It cannot stand that Europe is doing relatively well when we, for instance, fought the Nazis back in the day, right? Or, you know, we are the true heirs of the European culture, right? Also another book by one of the members of Charlie Hebdo, who was assassinated just a week before the book was supposed to be published. The way that he talks about how certain elements in, clerical elements in, say, Iran or Afghanistan, dislike the fact that they feel that they have the religious virtue, but then the West, that that debased place of lust and of profanity, has a rather comfortable life, right? So I think this idea of, well, if I can't have it, no one can have it. That's something that we should also bear in mind in these negotiations a little bit, because I mean, something that I feel that is often overlooked. So just top of my head.
Yeah, I mean, I just have an anecdote. I have thought about it during your question, that it's interesting how certain kinds of histories are still kind of with us in a very political sense, while other kinds of histories have become depoliticized as such. Working at the Norwegian embassy, one of our primary strategies of approaching the Irish was through the Vikings, the Viking heritage, which is obviously not a very positive experience at the time. But that was a key strategy of the Norwegian government, to the kind of play of this history that was so far back that we could kind of say we share DNA, quite literally.
Excellent. So, for me, both as a Canadian diplomat and as a Canadian advisor to politicians, in the international field, in the section that I headed, we were, as I said, we would establish offices in Palestine, in Ramallah, in Dhaka, we were in Juba, in Sudan, different places, and we would spend months before we'd even start engaging, just doing a lot of research. And so we had to understand that's what I was saying, we had to understand the social, political, economic, cultural, religious reality of that country. We felt we had an advantage over Americans and Europeans, because Canadians were neither colonial or imperialists. So, and we were a bilingual, juridical country. So we felt like we were able to sneak up the middle. We didn't have a past that was tainted to any extent. And we always felt like we weren't going to import Canadian values, but understand what their needs were going to be. So that always, and we would do that for months and months before we'd even start to have any dialogue or discussion. And then we'd go in, and the very first visits that we'd have, we would do widespread visits for months. We would almost call them assessment missions, where we'd spend several months working with the key players in the justice field to understand them, whether they were law professors or law societies or people in government. We really needed to try to understand what were they looking for. And that's how we would create projects.
It's really cool what you're saying. Sorry, just again, what association I had, Tony Judd's book on post-war Europe, one of my favorite, big overs out there. And I think there is a big lesson in the final chapter on admission to the European Union, as he saw it, for countries to apologize for what they did. He said every country did it at some point before or after accession. Even France in the 90s under Chirac, apologized for the Vichy regime, collaboration, etc., etc. But I think words, again, a few weeks ago I was in a museum back home in Austria, the Jewish Museum, and an art installation by, I think, a Japanese artist showed 3-4 hours of statesmen, mostly men, apologizing for something that their country has done in the past. maybe that is something that really we need to seriously consider if we want to create a blank sheet to begin our relations afresh. But I think the power of an apology, or of a not even reconciliation, but at least consideration for what has happened, or an acknowledgement, that seems to be quite important at the time.
Thank you for a very interesting session, but I must say that I'm slightly surprised that in a session entitled Current Issues in International Relations, no one has yet said anything about China. We have a country that is arguably, as a matter of international law, committing genocide against its own people, or a proportion thereof, which is exercising an awful lot of hard political power, especially against Taiwan, but also has an awful lot of soft political power, including, dare I say it, in this university. I wondered whether you had any comments on the role of China currently in international relations.
So when the three of us were talking about the panel and we were discussing, we thought we'd draw upon our own individual expertise. And so I think none of us up here are really experts in China. And so I think what I would have to say about China would be as valuable as what you have to say about China. I mean, all I could tell you is from my perspective is that it's a frightening prospect for me to think that it would be, and it would almost be cataclysmic, that if China decides to invade Taiwan, I think that's sort of like the big elephant in the room, like everybody's frightened about. They thought, was it going to happen after the Olympic Games? Was it going to happen when people's attention was taken by Ukraine? Biden is meeting with Xi next week, and he'll say, hands off Taiwan because we don't want you there. He's going to say, thank you very much. Next. I don't think that will have any impact. So I don't think, we chose not to engage in it only because we don't have that area of expertise, but is it a giant that will have profound impact on the world? Absolutely, 100% clearly. And the extent of which, I don't think we even know, because it will dwarf what's going on in Ukraine right now. It will dwarf it, just by sheer numbers and the likely impact globally. So.
I am also not an expert on China at all, but just returning to the difference between the West and the rest, in a sense, in terms of our perspective, I'm not sure that China has the same position in every discourse around the world. I think we saw that also with Russia and Ukraine, that China has been kind of the joker in international negotiations about Ukraine, because it hasn't fully embraced Russia, but it hasn't been willing to condemn them either. And a lot of southern countries have followed suit because they owe China a lot. And I think in many senses, China is doing a lot of good in the world for many people, maybe not for the right reasons, but lifting people out of poverty, improving socioeconomic conditions in many countries, including China itself. And I'm not sure if we can fully kind of understand the value of that coming from our kind of heritage and Western discourse. I'm not sure if I agree with, or I don't agree with what China is doing as a kind of imperial power, but I can also see that it's very persuasive to have a country that actually offers you the help you need in a very dire situation for many southern countries.
Yeah, well, very briefly, but I mean, upon coming here this morning by train, I read one of the, not the latest, but an issue of, Foreign Policy, the Foreign Policy magazine. And there were two articles in there. One of them was on China and the other one on the Gulf states. And the way that things were presented or presented themselves in this magazine was that China actually faces more difficulties over the next decades than we can even imagine, right? In terms of birth rate, in terms of stagnating international trade, in terms of a middle class that actually has means to spend money but doesn't really feel that it can. We don't know what's going to happen there. Whereas what we often overlook is the tremendous potential and also the rising star of countries like Saudi Arabia, like the Gulf states. So for instance, this article claimed that the median income in the United Arab Emirates was the same as Germany's, for instance. Did not know that. That the majority, that more women work in the high-tech sector in Saudi Arabia than in Germany again, right? That this country is set on exporting new energy, you know, solar panels and hydro energy and whatnot, right? So, and there's a real ambition and appetite there. The article said, oh no, that article was actually in the Spiegel, I'm sorry, but they said the politicians and officials there are drunk with self-assurance at this time. So maybe China will be the biggest factor in the room, but maybe for Europe it might actually be, for instance, the Middle East. I mean, we just don't know. But I think from what I gather, China's success story may face a few turbulence over the coming years. Also the way that it's sort of enmeshed in the international system and how it engages with us. So just watch this space, I guess.
Okay, thank you. It's really interesting. My question is around the current energy crisis. I think you touched upon that. What you've described, I think, is the political turmoil that's sort of there in the world, but underlying that has also created a fundamental problem for global economies around energy. I'm not a historian, but it was interesting to get the perspective of sort of the political story not having an understanding of maybe history. But what seems to be clear is that the political story certainly has no understanding of physics, because there's no way you're going to be able to run any of these economies on the solutions that are being proposed, right? You know, wind, solar, you know, batteries, etc. So, and that's landed the developed world in a very, very difficult place, which you can see today. So it will be interesting to get your perspective in terms of, you know, as some of these political agendas are being driven, you know, are they really in touch with, you know, some of the, you know, because when it comes to physics, there's no left one hand and the other hand, right? It doesn't work that way. So it's either do or die. So it will be interesting to get your perspective on that.
On the left hand, right hand, maybe there's a Leckhampton anecdote at this point. So I started here when we still didn't have our current master in his position, and the former master who was here was a diplomat, right, a British diplomat. And he at one point, I think it might have been Oman, or somewhere in the Middle East, and he complained to the Foreign Office about one of his advisors and said, send me a new advisor who only has one hand. Why ever only one hand? Because this guy always says on the one hand and on the other hand, and he just wants clear. Okay, that's maybe a quick sort of Leckhampton anecdote. Do you have any idea? I was horrid at physics at school.
You see, I'm not sure that there was a question in your comment, because I think the comment itself stands the test of having made a declaration. I think you're right. So I can't go beyond your question. It was so pressing and it's so clear that I don't know that it needs a rebuttal from me. I think it's just a good statement.
I just wanted to just turn back to the midterms and Ukraine. With the move towards a more Republican Senate or House of Representatives, and the idea that they might want to reduce the amount of money that they put forward for Ukraine. Do you have any views on that?
Yeah, I mean, so I was thinking about that, and I think the master and I might have chatted about that even a couple of nights ago. So the way it's looking now is I would hedge my bets on the Senate staying Democratic. I think that's likely to happen. I mean, we'll know perhaps by the end of the day today. I think by the end of Saturday, they were hoping to finish the counting in Nevada, and it was quite close. And they just need one state more. And of course, Georgia will become, you know, it could be the key battleground where all, you know, you'll have hundreds of millions of dollars being poured into this account, where it's astonishing. You have this reputable, intelligent, brilliant man on one side, and you have this rogue of a human being on the other side, and that he's vying for power because it's really, they represent parties. They don't represent themselves as individuals. If they keep the Senate, that will keep the check on the House determining that they won't want to be able to allocate monies. The House will be interesting also because there was no red wave. It was a cartoon described it as a red ripple, and they said basically you get a red ripple when you put a MAGA hat in the washing machine with your Ku Klux Klan robes, and you end up with a pink, ripple. And I think that's probably true. That's where they went, because they were so extremist, some of the candidates. But all to say is that if the margin is so small in the House as well, I don't know that they can be emboldened to do things that will go against the President and the Senate. There's three co-equal sort of arms of government. And I don't know that they'll have the clout. So I'm not overly concerned about it. I don't think that will happen. I just don't think that'll happen.
I've just been told I've got the last question, so I'm feeling very powerful now. I wanted to use it to take us back a bit to theory, which is what I studied when I was here. And so I guess my question is for Nanna. I wanted to ask a bit about what is the political project of digital technologies, or indeed of the singularity? You drew the comparison to sort of religiously inspired apocalyptic theory, where the political project might be to inhibit vice and to promote virtue, or it might be to control power in some way. It depends on the version of it. But what is the political project of the singularity?
Yeah, that's what I'm trying to figure out, I guess. But I think first of all, I think there are actually several political projects within the larger project of the singularity, because I look at the singularity with this Ray Kurzweil, very speculative idea. And then I also look at the transhumanist camp with Nick Bostrom and the superintelligence. And then I look at long-termism, which is this William McCaskill, What We Owe the Future, directed towards, or kind of in companionship with effective altruism, which is this movement towards doing the most good in the world possible, also into the future, which I think is a very interesting move. My first inclination, or the kind of thing that I thought was the political project of the singularity when I started this chapter, is that it seems to be quite an elitist project in many ways, because it presumes that certain humans will continue after the singularity has kind of happened. There's an idea of developing or expanding on the human body, and that certain humans will be transcended or become transhuman and will be living future lives in space, for example. And we see this quite kind of literally with the space tech billionaires who are going into space and kind of thinking about colonizing other planets. How feasible that is very hard to tell, but there is definitely a kind of political idea of elitism there, that certain individuals should continue the humankind, maybe somewhere else in the future. And what I find interesting about this project is that I actually think it's a bit conservative in many ways of the current elites, in the sense that the people who are supposed to become transhuman in this framework are the people who can afford, for example, cryonics, where they are frozen and will be woken up at some point in the future. I don't know why they trust people to actually wake them up. I think that's the biggest question for me. But there's definitely a kind of individualism paired with eugenics, which is a very interesting combination, because usually we think of eugenics as a kind of societal tool, but transhumanism has managed to pair these two things, and also kind of interestingly temporarily dwarfed every kind of current issue towards humankind in comparison to what we might face in the future. So especially the long-termists have this perspective that we need to make sure that all the people who could come into existence in the future are actually coming into existence. And every catastrophe that happens today then, whether it's climate change or whether it's historically, is actually not that important. And that's a very strange political project to me. And I think it's it's preserving of privilege. That's my initial thought, at least. I don't know if that answers your questions.
Wow. It's been an amazing session. Thank you so much. Thank you, Mark, Jakob, Nanna. Thank you to all of you for some wonderful questions. That's the end of the session. So we'll move on to the rest of the day. Thank you.